Well, I'm with Acton Academic Bio. Today we're going to do part 3 of your cellular respiration notes. And today we're going to start with anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration is the opposite of aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration uses oxygen. That's why when you do aerobic exercise, you are moving your muscles. That requires energy. And in order to make that energy, that ATP for your cells, oxygen gas is required. And so when you are exercising and using a lot of muscular activity, you're then using a lot of oxygen, and we call that aerobic exercise. In anaerobic respiration, anytime you put the prefix A or AN in front of it, it means not. So we will not be using oxygen. There is no oxygen used in anaerobic respiration. There's 2 types of anaerobic respiration that we're going to talk about today. First one is lactic acid fermentation, and the second one is alcoholic fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation, you can see that we only have a total of 2 ATP produced. Same thing with alcoholic fermentation. In aerobic respiration, the whole process makes 36 ATP. And 36 ATP is a lot of ATP, and it's able to keep your cells alive. But when there's no oxygen present, only 2 ATP are made, and that is not enough energy to keep your cells alive. And so when you have a lack of oxygen, your cells die. But before your cells die, let's talk about lactic acid fermentation, what happens in the human body. So humans and bacteria undergo lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation has 2 steps. The first step is glycolysis, which is exactly the same as yesterday in aerobic respiration. So the glucose is broken in half, and that's what produces the 2 ATP. Once that glucose is broken in half, that half of sugar undergoes lactic acid fermentation, and it's turned into what we call lactic acid. So our reactants for this, we start with a sugar. That sugar is broken in half during glycolysis, and then in step 2, that half sugar is turned into lactic acid. Now, in humans, in your muscles, lactic acid will build up after lots of heavy exercise, and it's what makes your muscles cramp. It's what makes your muscles burn and feel sore after a workout. It's what sometimes makes your legs feel tired and heavy after a run. And runners will actually use like those rollers and things, and they will try to roll out the lactic acid from their muscles so that it breaks down faster and their muscles recover faster from their workout. In bacteria, when lactic acid fermentation occurs, it makes specific flavors, and we use a lot of these flavors in the food that we eat. Fermentation has long been a way of preserving food, and a lot of the foods that you eat have lactic acid fermentation as their main method of fermentation. Most of these things have a very strong flavor to them. So fermentation and lactic acid fermentation produces a very, very, very strong flavor. And the other thing that's required in fermentation is these foods have to sit for long periods of time without oxygen. So think of foods that when we make them, we have to let them sit, or we say they age. And then when they age, they have a strong flavor. So some examples: cheese is made through a fermentation process. Some of the stronger flavors of cheese are aged or fermented longer, and then we get more of that lactic acid buildup. Blue cheese is made through lactic acid fermentation. Sour cream is made through fermentation, and so is buttermilk. Buttermilk is typically a flavor used in baking. It's not something you typically consume, but you can buy it in the grocery store. I don't recommend tasting it, but if you do, it is a very, very, very strong flavor, which is then why it's sometimes used in biscuits and pancakes. Miso and soy sauce are also made through fermentation. So if you've ever had those tend to be very strong flavors. Pickles are made through fermentation. Sauerkraut, that's a German word, is why it's spelled the way it's spelled. Sauerkraut is made by letting cabbage ferment. Kimchi is also made. It's a Korean dish, I believe, made by it's a fermented cabbage as well. Kefir is more of an Eastern European dish, drink, although it is becoming more popular in the U.S. It is basically a fermented milk, so it's sort of like a runny yogurt that you could drink. Okay. Yogurt is definitely made by lactic acid fermentation, and while you may not taste a strong flavor in your fruit yogurts, if you ever had plain unflavored yogurt, it definitely has a distinct flavor to it and a distinct taste. A lot of people don't like it because of its distinct taste, and that's why they then add other flavors on top of it. And lastly, it's 2020, and everybody tried to make sourdough bread this year, and sourdough bread is actually made. You have to let the dough age, and as you let the dough age, the bacteria go to work on the ingredients, and they break them down, and they produce a distinct flavor. Traditional real sourdough is actually made, they keep a starter at all times. So they take half the batch of dough and they don't bake it. They mix it in with the next batch of dough. And then, so the bacteria are already present. And then as that dough ages and it's ready to bake, they cut it in half and they bake half. And then they use the next half in the next batch. And so sourdough, if you tried to make it in 2020, is very difficult to make, partly because you have to let it sit. You have to let it undergo fermentation to get the proper flavor before you bake it. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is alcoholic fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation has two steps. Again, glycolysis part 1 that breaks the sugar in half and produces 2 ATP. And then when oxygen is not present, alcoholic fermentation will take over. And so what we start with is the sugar, and what we end with is alcohol and carbon dioxide. And that one's really important, the CO2. This is occurring in plants and in yeast cells. Plant cells undergo fermentation and yeast cells undergo fermentation. And so some common foods that are made through alcoholic fermentation, there's actually much less, but I believe they're more common. And the number one is bread. Okay, so most people say, Ms. Kaplan, bread doesn't have alcohol in it. Well, when you make bread, you have to let it rise. And so what's happening is you have the sugars and the other things in the dough, and you add yeast to your bread, and the yeast is what makes it rise. So again, bread has to sit for a certain amount of time, and as it starts to rise, the fermentation process produces carbon dioxide bubbles. And those carbon dioxide bubbles get trapped in the bread, but it's what causes the bread to rise, is the CO2 that's trapped in the dough. Now, you don't let it sit for very long, so it doesn't produce a very high content of alcohol. And if any alcohol that is produced bakes out when you bake it. That's why you can cook with wine and things for flavor. The alcohol bakes out, and there's no alcohol in it once it's cooked. The other two things that are made by alcoholic fermentation are beer and wine. So if you know anything about beer and wine making, wine is made from grapes, and they're crushed, and they add yeast to it. They put it in barrels and they seal it so there's no oxygen that can get in, and they let it age. And then 6 months or a year or however long later, the yeast has broken down the sugars and produced alcohol and carbon dioxide. Typically, the carbon dioxide works its way out of the wine, and that's why wine is not fizzy. Beer, on the other hand, is made from grains, and different beers are made from different grains, and the grains are ground up and sort of cooked in what they call water, like a mash, and yeast is added to it. And then again, it's let to sit in a giant vat, sit for months or weeks. And the yeast breaks down the grain and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. And typically, the carbon dioxide does stay in the beer. That's why beer tends to have more carbonation in it than wine does. I hope you learned something today, something useful. That's it for our cellular respiration unit. Please check back to Google Classroom for your next assignment.